could you introduce your background? And then Clive and I sort of know each other. We're getting to know each other, and we're going to be interacting together. I'm going to be asking him questions. He's going to be asking me questions, and we're going to be asking you questions as well. You might want to ask us questions as well. So Clive, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Clive, and I've spent most of my career in the banking industry as a bond trader, government bond trader in London, in Tokyo for many years, and I was made redundant, as is always eventually happens in the banking business, in 2001. Since then I've been doing various things, including training work, teaching work to people who come into the banking industry. I moved to Cambridge out of London because the children are leaving home. I want to live in the countryside, so that's where we are now. And then I got hooked up with Michael Schluter, and once that happens, you're then sucked into relational thinking. But it's always fascinated me, because having seen up close how dysfunctional the financial system is, it's always intrigued me, how can we make it work better? And it is all about relationships, for sure. And that's why I'm now kind of said to Michael and to Tim, I'm happy to help and see what we can do to take relation analytics forward and make it relevant to the real world, and get people to be more relational.
Thank you. So could you introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Yoshi. I'm from Japan originally, but now I'm living in Cambridge as a visiting fellow here at Twenty Classic College. To be honest, I just know about this relational thinking from Michael recently. So, however, very interesting for me, because in Japan, so as they know so many problems related to some individualism, consumerism, but now I'm an original economist. That's why I want to apply this idea into some Japanese economy to revitalize, yes? Not based on Christianity, but widespread of the idea.
Good. Thank you, Yoshi.
So I'm Julian Hildersley. I lived just outside of Cambridge for about 20 years. I have an engineering background. I'm on the edge of the Michael Schluter hurricane. And it's interesting that I've picked up this same expression that you used about getting sucked into the whole process from a few people now. And so I'm wondering what that's like, and so I'm sort of learning about that. I'm currently working, doing a bit of work with Michael about the Relational Peace Building Initiative into Korea, particularly around fundraising and publicity.
And I'm Tony, here from Manchester Met. I'm currently doing some research on SMEs and sustainability, and linking the whole idea of circular thinking to systems thinking, and looking to see how we can support getting more small and medium-sized enterprises into sustainable work based on thinking relationally. So I'm really excited about the whole thing.
Hi, I'm Nick Miller. I'm related to Michael Schluter. One of several here. I've been obviously aware of what he's been doing all these years, and I've used a number of different ideas in the work I did in social policy, in social care in England, local government and central government, measuring how you knew whether you were doing any good and who you're doing good for. You know, is it the workers, or is it the recipients of care? Is it their carers? Is it the social system at large? Quite complicated but interesting questions.
Moses.
Yeah, Moses, I'm from Singapore. So Michael brought his hurricane to Singapore in 2007. Then I made a mistake of coming to Cambridge in 2008. Then I'm stuck. Yeah, so I'm an adult educator back in Singapore. So mostly in adult learning and also consulting for relational thinking. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrew. My life again was perfectly fine and great as a asset manager for property developer and private equity in China until I met Michael around 8 years back. So there I goes to the point of no return, and I think you probably heard the rest of the story.
I'm Jonathan Rushworth. I live in Buckinghamshire, Western. One of my daughters lives here actually. I was a partner in one of the big city of London law firms for many years. That's where I spent my career. And after retiring, I spent a lot of time in Christian activities and charity activities, writing the history of our family business, kind of family music business in Liverpool. Quite interesting. Supplied 3 of the Beatles with the guitars, it's claim to fame. And I got sucked into the maelstrom. No, that's not the right word, is it? Hurricane. Yeah. A hurricane isn't the right word, is it, at the moment? Michael, some 10 years ago, and I was chairman of his company for 3 years, and I've been sort of clawing my way out ever since. It hasn't worked. So I've been particularly, because of my practice as a lawyer, it was corporate and finance law, and it was very interesting talking to him about it with his economic background, his relational thinking background, which having developed it with others. And then some of the principles I grew up with in my practice, actually the big corporates, were turned on their head. And I've written a lot with Michael, I've lectured a lot with Michael in this country and overseas. In fact, I'm going with him, I think, to Kenya. One of the things you should say is just say no and keep saying no. It doesn't work though. Anyway, I've been looking particularly at how we can change corporate practice, which is what I'm going to be talking about this morning. Big corporates in particular, which is the real challenge, because it's finance-driven, it's short-termism driven. And there are some encouraging initiatives Michael mentioned to the government, but sadly the government has backed away, I think, for political reasons. But I will keep fighting on anyway. It's very interesting for me to try and achieve this.
Very suggestive.
I'm an ex-diplomat aid official turned non-profit researcher, policy developer. And I've been at the relational thinking edge in terms of global affairs, sustainable development, humanitarian disasters, climate change issues, and it's been a privilege to be part of helping to promote relational thinking in otherwise quite resistant parts of the bureaucracy globally.
And just to complete the picture, obviously I'm Tim Young. I read a book back in 1993 when it was written and said, oh, that makes sense. And then I went off to the Middle East and started doing it. I had friends who were in the hurricane, and so I periodically would come back and wander through the hurricane and discuss things, but then head back off to the Middle East and carry on doing what I was doing. One of the interesting things in the Middle East, though, was that as a Westerner, I arrived and I was me, and you've done your introductions, and you're just you. But in the Middle East, when you meet someone, when they meet each other, the first thing that they will ask is, what's your family name? And I was a tribeless person. You can't trust someone who doesn't belong to a tribe. If you don't know which relationships I have, and how do you know whether you can trust me? And so one of the first things that I learned when I got to the Middle East is I need to introduce you, the people I'm talking to my tribe. My family, and I need to talk about my family so that you know that I haven't run away. I'm still in relationship with my parents and my brother and my wife and my children. And actually, I've got a lot of friends who I still continue to be faithful to. You can trust me because I have a track record of faithfulness to family, friends, etc. And I needed to give them sight of the relationships. And in that process that I've just done there, I've told you I've got a wife and I've got parents, not surprisingly. I've got family, I've got children. And we start to understand each other. Good. In this session, it's about an introduction to measuring relationships. but most people don't start by saying, you know what, I'd really like to measure relationships. I wonder what I could do if I could measure some relationships. They start with what could be termed reality. I'd like us to stop and think about some realities together. Clive, you were in the financial services industry. Could you describe the reality of the financial services industry?
Yes, I mean, I think we all know that things went terribly wrong 10 years ago with a great financial crash. And the reasons behind that, I think, are manyfold, but they come down to a few, really. It's greed, but that's not new. I think greed is something which has been around since the beginning of humanity. I think that it was a lack of accountability, a lack of, you can imagine where people do transactions but are never held accountable for them because the losses appear with somebody else. And we had a light touch regulatory environment where the philosophy of the day was that less regulation is always better. If you leave things to the market, things will be all right. I think that flies in the face of 3,000 years of experience where actually since the invention of money, it's always in the banking system, it's always had very tight state control for very good reasons, because the banking system is so highly leveraged and so important to the economy and people's lives that it can't be left to a bunch of people like me who don't have perhaps a broader view of what the world should be like. So that's really what went wrong, and I think at the heart of it was a sort of deregulation and the lack of relationship, I guess, between the different actors who didn't know each other. And perhaps we yearn for the old days. What was it like before all this deregulation and the financial markets suddenly went crazy with all sorts of people selling all sorts of products? And we remember the days perhaps where we knew our bank manager. Those of you who are from England will know a series called Dad's Army, where the bank manager is a sort of pillar of the local community. He knows what's going on. Perhaps we want a system where people are more honest and they do what they say they're going to do. Their word is their bond, and all that sort of thing. And we want more integrity in the system. We hark back to those days, but I'm going to suggest that that's actually not what we want at all, because that system was paternalistic. You could only borrow money if the bank manager approved what you were going to do with it, and Ian might have very different ideas about what is sensible. It was nepotistic. You couldn't get a job in the financial markets unless you went to the right school or came from the right family. And it was dreadfully corrupt. Insider trading was absolutely rife. Indeed, in many countries in Europe, it wasn't even a crime, and was accepted. So, do we really want to go back to the old days? No. But we do want something better, and I think it's very clear that that involves better relationships between people. And I think everyone in the financial industry knows that, but we're swimming around unable to identify what better relationships really means and how do we achieve them. Everybody wants better relationships, but how do we get there? And at this stage, I don't think the industry or people who charge the industry really know. And part of that is because still most people, or a lot of people in the senior positions in those industries are still in denial that something's wrong. We had a crash in 2007, 2008, but it's all right. We're kind of getting back to normal again. And that, I think, is the real danger. So that's the banking system.
So that's one reality. I don't like one problem. And there's a lot of problems in there, but that's not enough of a problem for me, as far as I'm concerned. Reality is way bigger than the problems in the financial services industry. and you're all sitting there, and you know that they, in the banking industry, are causing us a problem. What are the big, hairy, big, difficult problems that you're seeing? I'm going to literally come and ask you in a moment for some of the issues that you think are really important in the organisations that you work in the communities that you live in. But I'm also, in the meantime, I'm just going to ask Clive to give us another example of a significant reality.
Yeah, my family background, my tribe, is a tribe of engineers, civil engineers, and construction industry is equally difficult. You have architects, you have quantity surveyors, you have main contractors, subcontractors, the client, the local authority, the planning people, and they all fight like ferrets in a sack. All of those relationships are adversarial. And everybody knows, we'd all be much better off if there was a more cooperative approach. But it doesn't happen. Why not? Why can't we do this better? And when we all know that it could be done better. And I think that's perhaps a really, you can transfer that idea into almost any context where you have people who are adversarial, who know it doesn't make sense, but can't get out of that style of relationship.
We have a relationship with financial services, which is them. And we are over here and they do it to us. Part of the problem of a lot of what's going on is that they are a problem. The first step to measuring a relationship is to understand that you need a relationship. We are the problem. If I were to come and say, okay, so Moses, I've measured your relationship with your wife. He and Angela will go absolutely nuts. What right do I have to come in and start telling him how I've assessed his marriage? Now, if I come and I meet with them and we talk and we build relationship, and he and Angela say, we would really like to assess our marriage, and I say, I could do that for you, with you, and I measure the relationship and I feed it back to them, that's a completely different dynamic. And a lot of what lobbyists and sustainability people are doing is relationally unsustainable. It's walking into Moses' home and telling him how his marriage should be. It's going into underdeveloped areas and telling them, we've actually worked this out, and let me just come and check, yes, you're wrong, this is right. The first step to measuring relationships is to recognise that you need a relationship. There will be a relationship. The question is, what sort of relationship will it be? Will it be the judging relationship of walking into Moses' home? Or what will it be? When you've got the results, when you've measured something, what's it going to be? What's the relationship going to be? Am I going to go and say, thank you for telling me, I've measured your relationship. Hey, do you know about his relationship? What are we doing here? What's the relationship? The first rule of measuring stakeholder relationships is that there will be a relationship. The question, as you as a measurer, what's that relationship going to be like? Are you going to be loyal? So when we come to the financial services industry, are you going to be loyal to the financial services industry? Or are you just going to walk into their household and tell them how they should run it? Are you going to walk into the squabbling construction industry? Is it you should? What's the relationship? But there are lots and lots of relationships going on in the financial services industry. Clive has some relationships. He's not party to every relationship. He has some relationships in the construction industry. He's not party to every relationship. He sees repeated patterns of sleeping around between the different organisations and squabbling between the organisations. How does he choose which relationships to start with? Ideas? Which relationship should he start with?
His own.
That reasonable?
That seems reasonable to me.
Why would you start with someone else's? How dare you start with someone else's? So what relationships do you have with the financial services industry?
Right now, my relationship is with the training company who hire me to deliver training to the various banks.
Who hires you?
It's a company, and the woman who runs it, I have a relationship with her and her colleagues. The relationships I have in the financial industry, I'm a customer of the cooperative bank, and I still have a bunch of friends who work in the financial industry for various organisations. Those, I suppose, are my relationships.
And construction industry?
In the construction industry, I have friends who are in various sectors. I know a very good friend who's a quantity surveyor. My father was a civil engineer. He's retired now, but still has contacts. And then I have a couple of friends who are architects. And I've also been a customer of the construction industry, trying to get my plumbing done or whatever. So I suppose those are the relationships I have in the construction industry.
But if you wanted to solve the problems of the financial service industry, and we wanted to solve them, and Clive has some relationships, we would be throwing an individual at a massive system, most of which you can't touch. And it would be like throwing a little pebble through a forest. The chances of hitting a tree are minimal, and if you do hit a tree, it's not really going to change it. Part of the problem that we have in measuring relationships and changing the system is that we keep throwing individuals at the problem. I said that the start of measuring is the fact that you need to start with the fact that there's a relationship, but we also need to be throwing relationships at the problem. Not just throwing individuals at the problem. It's not about how clever Clive is. The dynamics change if he takes a relationship with him when he talks to the company that's doing the training. If the company that's doing the training engages with the banks, rather than just Clive engaging with the banks. The way to measure relationships involves relationships, and the way to transform relationships involves relationships. You learn from the same sort of thing. You have to start by working on your own relationships and then engage other relationships in it. But the dynamics of the system are very different. Measuring what's going on in the banking industry and measuring what's going on in construction, the dynamics, the conflictual banking industry, there are a whole load of stable relationships, perhaps too stable, and then a whole load of outsiders, retail. In the construction industry, you've got a complex set of people who keep working together or not working together, depending on how you want to describe it, and they are constantly competing, but it's project-based relationships, relatively dynamic. How you relate to a dynamic system versus a stable system, and what relationship you need in order to measure it is going to change. How you measure children and the relationships of children in a classroom is different from how you measure the relationships of the children in the construction industry. But the real question is, what do we measure? Do we measure how much activity is going on between Barclays Bank and NatWest? Between Barclays and the trading company that Clive has, that Clive works with? Is it activity that we measure? And we could. And perhaps we should. Do we know whether there's any relationship between Barclays Bank and NatWest? Between this bank and that bank? Do we know what activity there is? The existence of a relationship is something that you need to measure. What is it? Does NatWest supply Barclays?
Sometimes.
Yeah. What sort of things do they supply?
Well, they might be lending them money from the interbank market.
Okay, good.
They might be offering use of, banks now share branches, for example, in some places. They say, well, you can bank, if you're a Barclays customer, you can come in and use the NatWest branch.
And is the same true in the other direction?
Yes, it's typically reciprocal.
Mm-hmm. Reciprocal? That's interesting. When I worked in the city, and that's part of my background is working in the city, it was quite common for one trader to say to another trader, I've got my performance bonus coming up. Can I park my trades, my balance, my book with you tonight at this price, and I'll buy it back from you tomorrow at another price. And then I can make my bonuses, and then tomorrow, or when you've got your performance bonus assessed, I'll reciprocate. Nice reciprocal relationship. Knowing that relationship existed, really important. Because that changed the way some major investment banks assessed their performance of their staff. Knowing that a relationship exists is of itself important.
I think that's quite interesting because you have two large organisations, but actually the relationships that are experienced there are between individuals within those organisations. And whilst at an organisational level, you may have not apparently much relationship, but at a personal level between individuals in those companies, you have very close relationships between what are apparently competing companies. There ought to be bad relationships, you'd imagine, between the people who are on the trading floor, for example, at Barclays and NatWest. But oddly enough, at that level, they tend to be very good, maybe too good.
And there's high levels of trust between them.
They also agree LIBOR rate as well.
Yes.
Well,
As you said, Clive, it's all about their own individual wanting money, wanting their
Yeah,
friends.
yes. But there's a huge amount of trust and relationship between people, but not always beneficial.
And notice here, and this is really important, that there can be a relationship between two parties. And the interests of the world are not just that those two parties trust each other, have a good, close relationship. There are always third parties to every relationship. There are always third parties. Every relationship exists in a larger picture. And the problem with the trust between the two traders is that it's not in the interests of third parties. It's in their interests. And that relationship really works. And a lot of the time, in the construction industry, it's a competitive relationship. It's not working, either I win or you win, but it's also damaging third-party relationships. And indeed, as Tony was saying, everyone is a customer as well. The client is driving down the price, which is causing squabbling down in the construction industry, and then complains that they're not getting on, because they're a third party to this relationship.
Or contractors will collude to do a shoddy job,
Yep.
and certify that it's a good job to the detriment of the client. The relationship between the contractors and the inspectors,
Yep.
very good, very trusting, but corrupt.
And we could be that the client, the contractors, the architect all collude together to ruin the environment, to ruin something for the next generation. The fact that there are third parties in every relationship is crucial. Just measuring how our relationship isn't enough. Measuring that it exists and being aware that it exists and what the nature of it is crucial, but also knowing that there are third-party relationships. So part of the problem in changing the construction industry or the banking industry or any of the situations is that we tend to be too myopic and measure only one relationship. Even if we're measuring it on the back of a cigarette packet, we're not really thinking about the dynamics. So here is a question that Clive doesn't know is coming, and that is going to be a little strange. I could lend Clive a hand. I could lend him some of my human capital. I could help him. And it would be lending it to him because he doesn't get to keep me afterwards. He hasn't bought my time, hasn't bought me, he's borrowed me. I've lent it to him. How do you tell whether you are buying a relationship, borrowing a relationship, building a relationship, destroying a relationship? So in the banking industry, how do you tell whether your investment banking clients are buying the relationships of their staff, or are they renting them? Are they destroying them? Are they building them?
I think they're doing all of them at different times. That's a bit of a cop-out answer. But for example, they rent relationships. I go and work for a bank. They have relationship. I have, for example, relationships with other people out there. They pay me because of those relationships. They're kind of renting me, and if I don't like it, I can go and work somewhere else. If you work there for a sufficiently long period of time, you build relationships with clients or with your colleagues or with your managers. So we build as well. We have some pretty big bust-ups from time to time, and relationships get destroyed. So I think, do you ever buy a relationship? Well, I don't think you do, because we don't live in a world, we don't live in a country where slavery is legal. I mean, it does happen, but I've not been subject to slavery. I can always walk away. So I've never been bought as such. I've been rented, I've built relationships, and I've had relationships destroyed. I would say those three.
Is it possible? So he suggested that 3 out of the 4 are possible. Is it possible to buy a relationship? Sorry, was there? I heard a yes. How so?
I owe the bank money for my student loan. I get investors a loan by the bank, or until I pay the loan back, I can't walk away from that relationship.
You're not free to do that.
I think in the context of international development, I think if we be honest, there's a lot of relationship buying there too, because there are a number of instances where countries sign up to international conventions and they are forced to do certain things that might not match culturally where they want to go, in order to make sure that the greater train of funding keeps going. So I think that comes very close to what the sister is saying about buying a relationship at an individual level, but it's happening at the national level too.
That's interesting. So I'm going to suggest that you can buy relationships, but here, what you're actually talking about in some senses is selling relationships. There's a proverb that says, buy the truth, but never sell it. How can you possibly do that?
Tim, having a chat with my window cleaner, he told me that you get into the business of window cleaning in an area by buying the list for the person who's sold their list of clients. And you're looking at about 10,000 quid to buy a decent list. And then you immediately, you're the guy who turns up and washes their windows the next week. They may not know until you turn up.
Yep. Now, and that's a good example. I'm going to come back to it. But note this idea of selling relationships is where the indigenous communities sell something that was valuable, and they are forced to do something in return. And it is exploiting, and as a result of the sale, there is less relationship. The bank thinks it's buying a relationship with Emma by lending her money. But if at the end of the deal, when she's repaid the loan, she doesn't want relationships, they haven't bought a relationship. She might have sold them one, but they haven't actually bought it because they didn't get to keep it at the end. She rented them a relationship, and they did not deserve to keep it because they didn't give her a profit out of it. What does it take for me to buy a relationship with Moses' friends? He has to be willing to introduce them to me, but I have to be a worthy owner of that relationship. I could steal them from him, but he would never sell me another relationship again. I could cut him out, and he would never sell me another one. He could introduce me, but I could fail to be a worthy friend of his friends. And therefore I never get it. Even though he offered it, I couldn't buy it. I couldn't own it. like the bank, I've had the transactions, but I never owned the relationship. I merely had someone else running the relationship for me, hosting me, and I was just a guest. A lot of the commercial relationships are hosted, borrowed, there's lending of relationships. And one of the key questions that you need to be asking in measuring relationships is, are they your relationships in the first place? Are you going to have them afterwards? Clive could come in and he could introduce the bank to a whole load of people, and when Clive leaves, the relationships go with Clive. Or he could introduce them and the bank would be worthy of the relationship and keep the relationships, as well as Clive keeping the relationship.
I think that's interesting because I think that we see both of that going in the financial industry. People leave one firm and go to another, and they take relationships with them. So the first bank was merely renting those relationships through here. But equally, you see a lot of people who have fantastic relationships go off to another bank thinking that all the relationships will follow them, and then they suddenly find they don't. And actually the relationship did reside with the institution, not with the individual. And people are always very shocked to find out that the way that works.
So my closing thought for you is this. If you're going to go in and measure relationships, if you're going to deliberately increase your proximity, are you going to give them a profit? How are you going to tell whether there is more relationship there is more relationship here as a result? If you're going to use relational proximity merely as a technique to get people to sit together, if that's all you're doing, you're not thinking relationally. Measuring relationships is about paying attention to those relationships and understanding what is going to happen afterwards. Did I lend them to you? Did I sell my relationship?
Sorry, I'm troubled by some of the examples because they imply some level of autonomy in decision making. Mm-hmm. That you actually have a choice not to take a student loan, or that developing countries, can say that they don't want that power station or whatever it might be. And the other dimension that you've hinted at but we haven't quite discussed yet is the purpose of the relationship. Because there are lots of relationships that are just a connection, or a marriage is of convenience, or a contract, or a way of getting something that you wanted. And this third party issue that you raised is a really interesting one, because we tend not to think, if we are only thinking bilaterally, we're ignoring the externalities, which might involve huge costs for other people. So where does purpose come in?
So those are two really good points. One of the issues there is the issue of power dynamics and whether you've got choice, and the other one is to do with third parties, externalities, and those sorts of things. And as I often do, I love to combine problems. It is true that we don't get choices, but that doesn't mean that third parties don't have choices. And part of what we can do is help Emma with her relationship with her bank. Part of what we're doing in coming, Moses has committed to a relationship with his wife. Coming in and being a third party and choosing to engage and help that relationship can be good. It can be disruptive, but it can also be good. The third parties can be just sitting there judging and saying, oh, no one consulted me, or they can be engaging. part of the way to change a community is to change the community. By which I mean changing who is in that community. Is the relationship merely between Emma and the bank, or is it between Emma, the bank, and Clive, who has other relationships with the bank? So that it changes the consequences for the bank if they're nasty to Emma. Thinking about which relationships are relevant and changing which relationships are relevant, helping the World Bank realise that this group or that group are relevant, and increasing the bank's awareness of their proximity, that the future generations matter. Let us bring them closer. That helps with changing the dynamics and the power dynamics. Yes, Andrew?
Just as you are sharing, I can't help but think that complication of this, and usually where the frustration lies, is people start packaging those relationships and selling to someone else, as appeared to supply in many other cases. And a lot of times people, the frustration is you don't even know whether the relationship that you thought to be is the actual relationship, and without consent, suddenly there are many layers of other relationships along. And sometimes you might also come across cases with multiple owners of those relationships in the process. And that kind of complicates the whole dynamic.
Right. And now you can see why you desperately need to be able to measure the relationships. You need to be able to see what sort of relationship there is between the mortgage provider and the borrower. You need to know which relationships are material, which relationships are sadly immaterial as far as the bank is concerned. This is called, in banking, due diligence, except for that they do it like this. And they employ wonderful people like Jonathan to do legal due diligence.
Who charge lots of money for it.
Who charge lots of money for it, and we have a subprime problem. Third parties and the wider picture, and this is why I didn't come in today and say, hey, let me explain to you exactly how you measure this relationship and that relationship. Because the bigger picture is really crucial to measuring relationships. If we want to solve the construction industry problem, it is going to involve the construction industry, but they can't do it on their own. They are going to need third parties. I am constantly, the team is constantly talking to the construction industry, to the architects, to the civil contractors, and saying, you need help. Do you want help? Who of your network would also want help? Because we're willing to help. And we can engineer a solution for you. But you have to employ us as engineers. You have to invite us into your home. We can measure it and we can tell you what's going on and we can help you fix it. But you have to want the relationship with us as third parties to help you construct some more healthy relationships. At the moment, you're in the disruption industry. You need some help from a construction industry.
Just add to that, I completely agree with this.
Brilliant.
You can make it very complicated, and different industries,
work differently,
banking, etc., schools. But at the end of the day, everything's about people. That's the point, isn't it? And it's about relationships between people, isn't it? You're a banker, or an engineer, or a lawyer, or a school teacher, or a pupil. You're a family member, because that's a key area in this country, certainly destruction of family relationships and the consequence on the children. So that's what it all boils down to, and actually the fundamental principles are the same, whatever you're talking about, people dealing with people and how they build up the trust and the understanding between each other, and the confidence.
And I agree with you. You said I would, and you're now going to agree with me. It's reciprocity, you see.
Oh, yes.
It's also true that poor Emma, poor because she's in debt, rich because she's got relationships, poor Emma is constrained by a bunch of legal contracts. And often the construction industry is hampered by the documentation, by the legal system, and the people feel constrained. And you've got that dynamic, and relational thinking says, how do we help the people by changing other things, constructing different relationships, different agreements, different contracts? How do we construct better relationships for people to live in?
I think there's another thing you've been saying a lot too, Tim. You keep referring to reciprocity, which is a brilliant R word, because there's the assumption that there is some shared exchange in learning, or at least the potential for that. And sometimes there is not full honesty in acknowledging that reciprocity of learning, with an exchange of learning at every single time. The old consultancy model is about intervention, and maybe to some extent even too the medical model is about intervention, but not acknowledging the learning that comes out of that as a result of the so-called intervention, even the language that we use. And you've referred to reciprocity a lot, and I think that's really, really key.
But note, again, that it's not just about bilateral reciprocity. Actually, I need to extend stuff to Clive, and other people need to extend stuff to me. Maybe Clive doesn't have what I need. Maybe Clive doesn't have what the construction industry needs, but he's got relationships with them. And he needs to be supplied by someone else. So think of this in terms of supply chains. It's not just a game of tennis. It's having a relational economy that enables the supply of what everyone needs in a fair and just manner. I hope that I haven't spent my relational capital in this session. I hope that I have exercised it. That out of this, you are not poorer, but richer. I hope that I have exercised my relationship with Clive, not spent my relationship with Clive. And maybe you've got relationship with Clive out of this as well.
I'm really interested in this idea of buying and selling relationships, the idea of an ownership of a relationship, that it almost implies that one party owns the relationship, which seems to be a contradiction. So now you're introducing this idea of spending a relationship or exercising a relationship, and I sort of feel I'm on the edge of understanding that. Please could you elaborate?
First of all, I have to not spend my relationship with Beres. Can I answer that?
Absolutely.
Great.
I want to know the answer to that.
I am really naughty, aren't I? I throw in an extra word at the end. Fine. All relationships are joint ventures. Okay. They are joint ventures between at least three parties, the two parties and everyone else. Okay. They are joint ventures. So understanding every relationship as a joint venture is crucial. But understand that I can neglect my ownership of that joint venture, in which case you might run the relationship and I haven't. I behave as if I'm just a recipient and customer of that relationship. And I don't really own it. Or I don't allow you to own it. And I prevent you from exercising your rights to the joint venture, in which case it's going to shrink. So this idea of whether you are adding to the relationship, whether I am allowing you to have more out of this relationship, or whether I am sucking everything I can out of this joint venture.
Am I contributing or consuming?
Yeah. Am I hospitable to the relationship and to you, or am I just taking from the relationship? Fundamental to relationships that are sustainable is generosity. And that is fundamental to all JVs.